Anyway, I think it's time to get started. So good afternoon or morning, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Kristlyn Partica, and I'm the project manager for the Northern Grapes Project. Our webinar today is Winery Policies Across the U.S. and Northern States Region, presented by Bill Gartner. Bill is a professor in the Department of Applied Economics at the University of Minnesota. His research interests are branding, image, economic impact, and tourism development. He has conducted economic impact and baseline monitoring studies for the grape and wine industry in Minnesota and is doing a lot of work on economic impacts and also policy review, branding studies as part of the Northern Grapes Project. So remember today that as a participant in the webinar, you will not have the ability to speak even if you do have a microphone. Like I said, if we have too many live microphones, we end up getting a lot of background noise, and it's just really interfering. So if you're having any technical difficulties or have a question for Bill, please type a note in the chat pod over on the right side of your screen, and I'll do what I can to help. Bill is going to address questions at the end of the webinar, but if you have a question, go ahead and type it in because I keep track of them as the webinar progresses. So with that, Bill, I'm going to hand things over to you and let you get started.
Thank you, Kristlyn, and good afternoon to all of you on the Eastern time zone, and for the rest of you, good morning. I'm coming to you from the Twin Cities area of Minnesota, the icebox of the nation. Today is a beautiful day, sunny, and might even reach the 40s, so we're excited that spring is only about a month away, even though the calendar says it started today. Well, as you can see from the title of the PowerPoint, we're going to talk about winery policies. And a couple of students have been working with me on this. In fact, they're the ones that have been digging into the literature and into the policy legislation to see what we have and how they differ from state to state. So at first, I'm going to go over what we found out for the entire U.S., and then I'm going to focus in on the Northern States region, the project states for our work here. So this is what we did. We looked at, again, as I said originally, wine laws across all U.S. states, and primarily with respect to four major categories: sales, production, taxation, which I think is very important to those of you in the business, and also registration. We're not done with that work, and a lot of what I'm presenting today is preliminary, as this work will continue through the early part of the summer. We also want to take a look at what these policies meant in terms of impacts to the wineries operating in the Northern Great States. Did they seem to help with respect to revenue, or did they restrict growth and sales? One thing we found out rather quickly, there's a lot of ambiguity in the laws, and in fact you have to read quite carefully, and maybe it requires a lawyer's degree to be able to make sense of all this stuff. But there are layers and layers of laws embedded within the winery policies. And one of those ambiguities is the requirement of multiple license. You can get an initial license to just produce wine, and then if you want to do other things like tasting rooms and so on, you need additional license. And I'll go over that in a few minutes when we get into some of the slides. And one thing that became clear to me, not only after talking with many of you in the business, but also looking at what we found out, that we believe that there are many, many policies out there that are not embedded in wine legislation that affect sales and production and the ability to expand. For example, general liquor laws, but going beyond that, local laws regarding zoning and things like holding festivals and events affect an operation of a winery. So we're just going to scratch the surface here today by talking about laws that are, or policies that are embedded in legislation directed specifically at wineries. Okay, one of the important ones is this requirement to sell their products through licensed middlemen. And if you are a large winery, you tend to favor this because you can control, with economies of scale, pricing, and also where your products go. If you're a small winery, it actually, selling through a licensed middleman actually raises the price of the final product before it gets to the consumer. And this may be one reason why we're not seeing a lot of wine show up in the menus of restaurants that promote local foods As you'll see later on, there's just not a lot of sales from farm wineries to restaurants or even to farm markets. And maybe it's partly because production isn't high enough, but I think more important, it's because of the requirement to sell through distribution channels and not directly to, say, to a restaurant. Okay, permission to dispense samples on premise, and this is where we get into some of the ambiguities of the law. This actually relates to the tasting room. Can you have a tasting room? And those of you in New York, you know you have tasting rooms, same in Washington. But that requires another license be purchased. The initial winery license that you get just gives you permission to produce wine. And then you, of course, sell it through the distribution channels. But if you want to actually have tasting rooms on premises, then another license is required. And you'll find that throughout the winery legislation that we looked at, there can be multiple licenses required in one state to do additional things to gain additional revenue. So it's not so easy just looking at the policies and saying that's the way it is, yes or no. Okay, one of the things that some of the winery legislation explicitly points out is that wineries can't offer, we say bread and cheese, but garnishes, small snacks in the tasting room. Some of these are embedded in the legislation and some are left to the, there might be additional legislation addressing this, or there may be legislation not allowing this at all. And one of the things we found out is that, as you'll see, most of the sales to the customer, especially from the small farm winery, is through the tasting room, and this enhances then the experience in the tasting room. So this may be affecting some of you in the states where it's either difficult to offer this or impossible to offer it. Permission to sell at additional outlets. I found this one very interesting. And for example, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, you can have a farm winery, that's it. All sales have to take place direct to the customer at your place of business where you produce the wine. Now, for other states, you can get up to an additional, I think, 4 or 5 additional outlets. And this goes more into the ability to increase sales rather than to attract people to an area. We're really looking here at 2 different types of winery operations. The farm wineries that restrict sales to the premises of where the winery is located makes that winery a tourist attraction. And we're seeing a lot of economic impact coming from tourists who travel to the winery. Where you can have additional outlets, you're not looking at the winery so much as a tourist attraction. You're trying to give the winery opportunities to increase overall sales. So what does that lead to? Well, let me give you an example. As I was traveling, and it was last year in the summer, I noticed a winery distribution or retail outlet along one of the interstates. And if those of you are old enough might remember the old Stuckey's shops, businesses, the pecan logs that were advertised. Well, this is one of the old Stuckey outlets, and they're quite distinctive, so you can tell them if you have visited them in the past. And so I stopped, and all this was to sell wine. This was not a winery where it was produced, and it was simply a retail outlet. So right behind this outlet was an exotic dancer sign, big one, going up high over there. So you really couldn't look at the winery without seeing the exotic dancer sign in the background. Now, some might argue this is a tourist attraction, but really all this is simply giving wineries an opportunity to increase sales. You can debate whether or not this is a good thing, but when you add additional outlets, you take away, I think, the opportunity for making the winery the centerpiece of tourist attraction for a rural destination. Okay, permission to have on-site restaurants. Again, this is addressed explicitly in some legislation, but you'll see in many wineries across the country this is not allowed. Unless, again, if you dig deeper and deeper into it, you might find where an additional permit will allow you to have a restaurant on site. Okay, I think another very important one, if we look at wineries as tourist attractions, and again, this would be focusing on the smaller farm wineries, it's very important then that they have these special events and in some cases festivals to draw people into the area. That adds to the economic impact in the rural area, and it's also the way that the winery makes its sales, because most of the sales for these small farm wineries are do take place on the premises of the winery. Okay, another one that I found interesting, it doesn't affect too many states in the northern states project area. It does affect South Dakota, but some states do not allow wineries to ship directly to the customers. This, again, is minor in terms of total revenue, as you'll see a little bit later. But if the winery does have a clientele that they attract through tourism, and some of these tourists are from out of state, this can pose a barrier to getting the wine that these people like directly into their hands. Now, I've heard of some innovative ways of doing that, like marking the wine olive oil when it's shipped out. But I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just saying some people have found ways around this legislation. Cap exists on total gallons produced annually, and there's only a couple states where this is explicitly addressed, Minnesota and Indiana, and the other ones, few of them say it's not, there's no cap, and then many of them don't even address this at all, which would seem to assume that there's no cap. But the cap exists in total gallons, and I don't know why this is. I suppose it may be an attempt to keep the wineries as farm wineries, small wineries, but beyond that, I can't really venture a guess why this legislation is there. Minimum state fruit content, minimum in-state fruit content. Again, this is one where you're trying to promote locally grown grapes and the small farm winery. And we'll see that embedded in the legislation, a few of our northern grape states have this requirement that they have to meet minimum in-state content with the wine they produce, unless there's a crop disaster in some years, and they can apply for an exemption to be able to import the juice to continue their business by making wine from imported grapes or imported juice. Now, there are councils, as you'll see here, Wisconsin, Arkansas, Colorado, can add Michigan to that list, where it's not embedded in the legislation that authorizes the winery to operate, but it is part of the, say, specific wine industry council, where if they're going to certify wines, they have a minimum in-state fruit content, which they require. So even though it might not be listed as a policy for a particular state, the Wine Industry Council or a similar body in that state may require it if you want to have their certification. This one I found pretty interesting because there are some states out there that are looking to promote local production, and they have a number of tax credits and subsidies associated with their policies to allow that to happen. For example, Missouri, if I remember correctly, has a subsidy for locally grown grapes, whereas Arkansas, I believe, has a tax credit for locally purchased equipment used in the operation. So again, this is an attempt, I believe, to assist the businesses within the state to create the linkages between providers of inputs within the state so that total impact can increase as a result of a winery's operations. Okay, so now we're going to move to specific policies that affect the cold hardy wine industry in the northern states. And here you can see the states in red that we're talking about. These are the states that we looked at when we did the baseline and economic impact study, and these are the states that are included in the Northern Grapes Project. And as you can see here, there's been exceptional growth in recent years. So more than 80% of the wineries that operate today have been established since the year 2000. And I think this is due directly to the introduction and widespread use of the cold hardy grapes that are now available in the marketplace. In fact, if you go back and look at our baseline study and you look at red grapes, you'll see that Marquette, which I believe was introduced only in 2006, is now the dominant red grape being planted, and it has the most vines in the ground in the northern states. So major growth in a very short period of time. And part of that, again, is due to the legislation that establishes farm wineries and tends to support these wineries as rural development agents or as tourist attractions. Now, when we looked at what are the barriers to winery growth, the number one is government policy. Okay, so people are telling us, winery owners are telling us, they see government policy as the biggest barrier, more so than capital availability or sales or skilled labor availability or cost of labor. It's government policies. What we were not able to determine from the baseline study is what are those government policies. That's why we began with this overview of policies affecting all states and then focused in on those affecting the northern grape states. So we know it's important to you, and we're just trying to figure out which policies are the ones that are the most counterproductive to achieving winery growth. So we collected data from wineries across the 14 northern states in 2012, and we looked at the information that primarily pertains to sales and production, and there were 56 observations in 10 states. Now, one of the things I mentioned last year, I believe, in the webinar we conducted is we're going to be doing a follow-up analysis, assuming we get the specialty crop grant again to continue our project. We're going to be doing another baseline economic impact at the end of the project to see what changes have occurred, and we really need more observations to make this work. So 56 observations from 10 states is not really a lot, and it adds some noise into and variation into the data set, so we're unable to really come out with some specific results about how a winery or policy actually affects a winery. We can come out with some general results, but being more specific, we actually need a few more observations. So let's take a look at some of the policy variables that we were looking at. The market regulation, and I've gone over these for all the states before, but now we're going to focus in on just the northern grape states and selling by the middleman, the distribution channel, where the wholesaler has to be a part of this. And we see that operable in a number of states. Tasting rooms where they can allow the wine, cheese, the garnishes. We see that's very common in most of the states, but there are also a number of states where it's prohibited. And again, I don't understand the reason for it being prohibited, but maybe some of you do. This is something that as we follow along and we complete some more work in this area, we're going to have to take a look at. Direct shipment to customers. There was only one state in the northern state grape region that can allow that. That was South Dakota. So in terms of what's the impact on revenue, not much, because South Dakota is not, as a percentage of total sales in the northern grapes region, it's a small percentage. So we really couldn't figure out what's the impact of that. Excise tax, I found to be pretty interesting. This is the dollar charged per gallon of production, and it's based on alcohol content of between 7 and 16%. So, for example, in Illinois, for every gallon, there's a $9.03 excise tax, whereas in New Hampshire, you see it's zero. And the reason it's zero in New Hampshire is because sales are done through state-owned stores, and therefore we don't even know if there's an excise tax in there. States are not as transparent in their taxing and pricing policies when it's through state-run stores as when you don't have that control. We do find very low excise taxes in Minnesota and in Nebraska compared to some of the, Wisconsin compared to some of the other states. And as we found out, taxes at this point don't seem to be a big issue in terms of sales. Now, those from Illinois might argue otherwise, considering they have quite a high excise tax. And then the minimum in-state group content for the farm winery, I've already gone over this, but you can see the percentage here. For Minnesota, it has to be at least 51% majority. Nebraska is up to 75%. New York, we have 100%, and those of you in New York can tell me whether or not this is accurate, but that would be for, I believe, the small farm winery, and in South Dakota, 51%. Again, we know in Michigan there's also one if you want to be certified by the industry council. Okay, here's some of the results. Now, the chart I'm sure is pretty difficult to see, and we'll make this available if you want to take a closer look at some of the quantitative results, but here are some of the findings. The price of wine doesn't really affect winery sales. So at this point, especially if you're talking about a farm winery, where people are making the effort to come to the winery, and most of these wineries are located in rural areas, there's a significant cost associated with that travel. And the price of the wine then doesn't seem to be too much of a barrier than affecting sales, because people have already made a financial commitment just to get there. It's all about the experience, being at the winery, tasting the wine, and some of those bottles are going to go home with them. So at this point, with the way wine is priced across the different states, we don't see that as a significant barrier. And we see labor input has positive and a significant effect on winery sales. And all this is telling us is that the more labor that you employ, the more labor that you have involved in the production of wine, you're going to see higher sales, and that makes sense. I mean, why would you have a lot of labor if you're going to have small sales? So the larger the sales, the larger the labor input required. Grape input has a positive and significant effect on winery sales. And this is the value of the grapes, not the minimum in-state fruit content, but the value of the grapes being used. So the more you spend on grapes, obviously, the more you're going to have to sell, and that we show a positive effect then on winery sales. Another thing we took a look at is the owner's motivation, whether they're going to expand, whether they're going to stay the same, or whether they want to get rid of the winery in the coming years, in the near term. And we could find really mixed effects. There was no significant effects that tell us that whether or not they plan to sell the winery 2 years from now has any effect on winery sales. So I would think that, you know, intent of what you want to do in the future is independent of sales at the moment. Okay, we also found out that policy that restricts potential channels, again, this would be things like the distribution, having to go through the middleman, or direct sales, has mixed effects upon winery size of sales. What we found out is the larger wineries, the real, what we say, commercial and not the farm wineries, they're very much in favor of having these distribution channel restrictions, having the sale through a middleman. Because then through economies of scale, they can control distribution, they can either control, cost of the wine that's being sold, whereas the farm winery itself, which is selling most of its winery on premises, is not that much interested in the distribution channels at the moment. If they expand, if they get larger, if they grow beyond simply being a rural attraction and having most of the sales occur on site, then this could become an issue. But at the moment, mixed effects, we're not seeing a lot of significant effects. The policy, however, related to tasting room sales is an important factor that influences winery sales. And as you see in the chart that I'll show you in a minute, most of the sales, again, from the farm wineries are through the tasting room. And so any policy that affects how the tasting room operates is definitely going to have a direct effect on sales. And I would think this is where the effort needs to be focused to make sure that the policies are conducive to winery growth, especially for the small farm wineries. If that's the intent of the legislation, then you have to take a look at how the legislation is designed to affect how a tasting room operates. Again, as I mentioned before, direct shipment has ambiguous effect. Well, there was only one state, so we really couldn't tease out how direct shipment might have affected winery sales. And the excise tax, which I showed you, no significant effect on winery sales that we could find out. Now, the last one is really quite misleading, and I'll have another slide with this later on. So minimum in-state fruit requirement has a large negative effect on winery sales. Don't believe that. I mean, that's what the statistics tells you, but we see that we're really looking at the small farm wineries compared to large commercial wineries. So obviously the large commercial winery is going to, and those large commercial wineries are not located in states where they have the minimum in-state fruit requirements. So they're going to have much larger sales, much larger revenue compared to the small farm state winery, and that's what's behind this result. Not that the more of an in-state fruit requirement you impose on farm wineries, the negative effect, the larger the negative effect on sales will be. However, this does bring up something of concern for the future, and that is there needs to be legislation that is directed at the commercial operations and separate legislation that's directed at the farm wineries. These are two different animals, and they require different policies for both of them to do well. So a policy that may actually benefit a farm winery, if applied to the whole state, would not benefit, especially with minimum in-state fruit requirement, a large commercial winery of the type you might find in Michigan or New York. Okay, market regulation. What we're finding is, yes, this again is selling through the middleman requirement that you sell through the middleman before it can get into other outlets like restaurants, farm markets, and so on. Again, we find that the market regulation benefits those wineries. The revenues of those wineries are larger that have large production. So the large commercial scale wineries benefit from these restrictions, and they would probably tend to support then the middleman requirement. Well, the farm winery, they don't really feel any impact on the policy yet because they are, again, very small in size. They're new, even though many of them intend to expand, they haven't gotten to the size yet where the distribution channel regulation that is in place right now is going to have a great effect on their sales. This could happen in the future, so this is something that does need to be monitored. The tasting room, and here's a chart that I wanted to show you in the lower left-hand corner. And you can see how this has changed through the years, but really we're talking about tasting room sales. Over 60% of the winery sales are coming from the tasting room. And this is not just farm wineries, so we're throwing some of the commercial wineries in here too. If you got rid of them, we'd see a much higher percent, probably in the 80% range, where winery sales are coming to the tasting room. Look at the small number, the third one over, it says restaurant. So we're dealing with, less than 1.5% of current sales are coming through local restaurants. And I know a number of wineries out there have attempted to cultivate local restaurants, and it's been a very difficult task. And part of this whole local foods movement has seemed to ignore local wines. So this is something I think that needs to be studied a little bit more and figure out what are some of those barriers that exist from getting the wine into local restaurants. One of those could be the middleman requirement that effectively raises the cost of wine before it hits the restaurant, which again will increase the price significantly when they try to resell it to their customers. So direct shipment, as we said, at less than 0.5% of total sales at this point. It's no issue whatsoever. So again, we're looking at where the distribution of sales is now, and for farm wineries, the tasting room is the most important thing that we need to take a look at. Liquor stores, and I guess one thing that we didn't have in here is, for example, in Iowa, a lot of the, some wine, I won't say a lot, but some wine ends up in the Hy-Vee store. So you can go into one of the local supermarkets there and you can see a whole section designated to local wines. And I haven't seen too many other states where this is the case. So there is an additional outlet there for those in Iowa, which don't seem to be available to those in some of the other states. I know in Minnesota we don't go into our local supermarket and find local wine. Okay, direct shipment to customers. I don't want to spend a lot of time. We've just gone over that, and really it's of no concern, except maybe for a few of you in South Dakota that can't south of some of the tourists that come through, and you'd really want to be a steady customer of yours. The excise tax, as I mentioned, doesn't seem to be an issue at all. Those in Illinois, you can weigh in, and you have the highest, but for the most part, it's not a large amount, and it doesn't seem to be affecting winery sales. The minimum in-state fruit requirement, we also have gone over that, and you can see again for the low 25%, those are the small farm wineries. They seem to benefit from this minimum in-state fruit requirement, although their sales, their revenue, their production will be very small compared to the other end, where you have the large commercial wineries that don't seem to benefit from this in-state fruit requirement. Again, this points out the need to have flexible policies directed at the size of the winery, where you keep the small farm winery more of a tourist attraction, a rural development agent, whereas the more commercial wineries, they need to look at export, they need to look at increasing sales any way they can. So let me just end with a few observations here, and then I'll follow up with what we're going to do next. So wine policies, I mentioned this, that relate to tasting rooms affect farm wineries the most, and this is where some of the efforts that the legislative end should pay attention to those, what's going on there, and how do you come up with policies that increase the effectiveness of a tasting room, whether it's to add on the ability to offer food or having a restaurant on premise. The tourists, the customers are coming to the winery. Most of the sales are at the tasting room. What policies can be enacted to enhance that experience and to increase sales to the tasting room? The market regulations affect winery operations minimally at the present time, unless you're a larger commercial winery that relies not so much on tasting room, but on export markets, and there it's a different story. So as I mentioned before, these two types of operations should be treated differently, as farm wineries are tourist attractions, and although the commercial scale operation can also be considered a tourist attraction to an extent, it's not getting most of its money, sales, through the tasting room and through the tourists who are coming through. So winery laws may not be the regulations that bother winery owners the most. I mentioned this briefly before, and I'm beginning to feel that it's local regulations, local government regulations that have the most effect on winery operations and bother winery owners the most. And in further work that we're going to do, we're going to try and zero in on this to see if we can find some commonality with respect to local regulations, whether they restrict the number of people who can come to a festival or event, or even where the winery can be located. These may be the policies that have the most significant effect on operations. And that's when I say at the end here, the local regulations may be more burdensome than the state wine policies. So what are the next steps? Well, we need to refine the policy analysis. We need to take a closer look at taxation policy on wine sales. We don't see a big effect right now, especially with excise taxes, but that doesn't mean that you can just simply go ahead and increase taxes on wine and you'll have no effect whatsoever. There's got to be a point where this turns around, and so we're going to take a look at this more closely. We're also going to take a look at the tasting room policies a little bit more closely too, and see if we can build on these preliminary results and definitively state that certain policies do enhance tasting room sales. We're also going to create an index with 4 subcategories: the sales, production, taxation, and registration. And we'll see the degree to which the legal environment, the policies are favorable or are barriers to winery growth. And as I mentioned, we want to collect data on policies not included in the state winery laws. So how are we going to do this? Well, we need to collect primary data now from winery owners and managers. So we're looking at, and Tim, I know this might be new to you, so I'm going to have to go back and revise what we've already written, but for the next 2 years of the grant, if we're invited to apply for that, because I think we need to take a look at doing some focus groups at the wine conferences held in the northern grape states, like the Cold Climate Conference here in Minnesota, or the winery conference that we attended in Rochester a couple years ago, or the Michigan conference that the council puts on. So I think we need to talk to people directly and let them tell us what they're facing with respect to barriers, policy barriers. And then after that, we might be able to do a survey of winery owners, managers, where we've got some common policies and they can assess the degree of a problem that these policies pose. And with this information that we're collecting, we're going to create a database for winery policies, which we'll post on the web, so that someone from another state can look at what's happening in neighboring states, and with our results, see if some of the policies that are in those neighboring states are beneficial to winery growth. They could use that information then to maybe lobby their government for a change in policies or an enhancement of certain policies. And as Kristlyn mentioned at the beginning, we're also doing some branding work right now, looking at the attributes of the grapes, the cold climate grapes, and looking at some of the attributes of the wines that are produced here to see how this might help you in your branding initiative. And we want to be able to combine some of the policy results with the branding work, research that we conduct to see if we can see how policies can enhance the branding that you're doing. So that's it in a nutshell, and I'll end there. And we've got a little bit of time left, it looks like, for questions. I've not looked at the chat box, so I don't know what's out there. So I guess, Kristlyn, you'll tell me what I have to do next.
Yes, I've been keeping track of questions. So we have quite a bit of time left over, and so, Bill, you would welcome questions that people have, say, regarding the baseline survey, if they have questions like that, right?
Yes.
Okay, so guys, if you have questions about the baseline survey or any of the other work that Bill's doing, feel free to ask about that. You don't have to limit your questions to what was covered in the webinar, actually. So the first, I guess it was more of a comment from Patrick, maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek, said, excise tax, no effect on sales. Don't let the politicians see that. They'll all want to raise the sales tax.
Well, now the sales tax is a little different. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I mean, once the politicians see that there's no effect on sales, your taxation will go through the roof. However, as I mentioned, there is a point where it does affect sales, and we hope to be able to take a look at this more closely and maybe even figure that out. But at the moment, the excise tax doesn't seem to have an effect on sales, and that's because people are coming to the farm wineries, I mentioned, spend a lot of time and money to get there, and they're going to go home with something that delights them after they've been through the tasting room. So if it costs a couple extra dollars to get that bottle of wine because there's some tax in there, at the moment, it doesn't seem to affect overall sales.
All right. Then we had another question from Kathy, and she wanted to know if wine clubs, like monthly and quarterly sales, were included in tasting room figures.
No, they were not. And we have looked at wine clubs, even though that's not part of the policy legislation. It's usually not addressed specifically in the policy legislation. What we found from other published work is wine clubs, for these small farm wineries, they don't seem to be that major of an impact on sales. It's not to say that, you know, you might have an effective wine club with a core group of people that just really love your wine and like to get it on a regular basis, continue that. But in overall sales, wine clubs at the moment are not that significant.
Okay, then Tom asked, what is the normal percentage that the middleman gets?
That's a good question, and I do not have an answer for that. And I don't know if it's a set percentage or a negotiated percentage, just what it is. But excellent question that we'll take, and we'll see if we can at least begin to figure that out.
Okay, and then Keith asked, commented that a lot of what you presented relates to wineries that are already established. And he wants to know if there are any issues related to regulations in wineries that are just starting up.
I don't think there would be any other regulations related to new startups. What we did is we looked at the farm winery legislation or the overall winery legislation in each of the states. So whether you're a startup or whether you're a established operation, these are the policies that affect you. So for example, if you want to start up in Minnesota and sell wine, you know that you have a 51% minimum in-state fruit requirement. You know that going in. If you're operating, you still have to live with that. Now, there are some exemptions to that. You know, Minnesota is known for its variable weather, and if we get a disastrous spring or we get huge storms in the summertime that destroy the crop, you can apply for an exemption of the minimum in-state fruit requirement. So that's a safeguard against any weather-related or disease-related events that might occur. So I think most of the states have those safeguards built in, but I don't think that a startup is going to be affected any more than ongoing one by the legislation.
Okay. Then Mike White just commented that 54.5% of all native Iowa wine is sold via wholesale or in grocery stores and things like that. So that's pretty cool, Mike. I don't know if any of the other states producing more, I guess, less of the more common wines are like that. That's pretty interesting.
That is interesting, and that's what I noticed when I traveled through Iowa, and I did go to the local supermarket and saw a very large section. You come to Minnesota, you're not going to find it, but you won't find any wine in their supermarkets. You'll find it as an annex building, but you have to leave the supermarket to get into the liquor store. But in other states that I've been to, you don't see this much of a presence, especially when we're talking about farm wine, in the local supermarket or even in our local liquor store. You can go into the liquor stores here in Minnesota and you might find just a few of our wines represented there. So there might be barriers due to the distribution channel, the middlemen that prevent that raise the price and make them non-competitive against some imported wine. But on the other hand, maybe our wineries aren't that big yet to be able to focus that much on how they can get their wines into local liquor stores or into other outlets like restaurants.
Yeah, and then Tim Martinson commented that New York, in addition to our farm winery licenses, also has commercial license. And
Correct.
So many of the mid-sized wineries here have the commercial licenses, which is 15,000 cases and up, and comments that they're more likely to sell off-premises with distributors, and they can also buy non-local fruit. So.
Correct, that's right. And as you get through the legislation, you'll see that there may be 3 or 4 different types of permits required. One is a permit just to operate. Another one is a permit to have a tasting room. Another one might be a permit to have multiple outlets, and so on. So there's no shortage of permits. Government knows how to get its money or get its hand into your pot and get the money out. And requiring all these different permits is just one way of doing that.
Yeah. And then Tim also asked, said that the Wine Institute in California and Wine America also do a lot of work on policy issues, and he wants to know how their results and publications tie in with what you're doing.
Yes, it's right. In fact, they do have, I think, a website where they go over some of the policy issues. But what we could not find is a website that had all 50 states and talking about, as I did, these different categories that we're looking at: sales, production, taxation, and registration. So what we're doing, I believe, is a complement to what they have done. And like I said, we hope to get this up online, and then people can look and see how policies differ between states. And as far as we could tell, the Wine America folks have not got to that point yet where they've gotten very specific about policies and their differences between individual states.
Okay. And then we had a comment from Patrick who says that in future studies it might be interesting to investigate whether or not farm wineries...
Kristen, I've lost you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Okay, I lost you. You just came back in.
All right.
Could you repeat what you said?
Yeah, so we have a comment from Patrick, and then he and Mike White kind of talk back and forth a little bit. So I'll kind of go through that. But anyway, Patrick says, in future studies, it might be interesting to investigate whether or not farm wineries would support the notion of requiring some sort of basic education requirement in order to obtain a winery license. He observes that many new small wineries are producing wines of questionable quality, and that may negatively affect the reputation of all wineries in the state or region. And perhaps we need a hurdle for basic winemaking skills in order to ensure some basic quality in the wine produced. So anyway, then Mike White said that he disagrees and that thinks that government regulations will only limit the growth of the industry, and suggests that quality issues should be handled by individual state associations and customers who aren't willing to buy. And so then Patrick commented back that that's a good point, and maybe associations could devise a voluntary education or skills certificate program. So anyway, just if you have any comments on all that,
yeah,
feel free to
I don't know if requiring a certain education certificate is the way to go. Maybe this has to be handled more by the businesses themselves. And in that step, we could talk, or in that case, we can talk to Merle, who's proposed a Vintage Quality Alliance program where wines can be certified by an independent third party. And obviously those that are not meeting the standards will get the certification, and that might be some message to the customer that they meet minimum standards of winemaking quality. So different ways to go, but adding an educational requirement, I don't know, because I don't know if the people that are coming into the winemaking business, some of them are coming from Argentina, some have been trained in California, whether they have any educational certificate or whether they've just learned on the job. Sometimes, you know, the artist learns on the job. So different ways to look at it, but I definitely think a Quality Alliance, industry sponsored and supported, may be the way to go with this.
Yeah, and then Mike commented further that Iowa currently has the Iowa Wine Quality Program, which identifies quality wines for the customer. And we are now looking into certifying the wineries themselves, so maybe in the future. So
yeah, I think that's what Merle's talking about. And he's got that proposed for our next go around to see if sort of this program that you find in Iowa and there's similar programs up in Ontario, where there's something like that can be useful for most of the northern great states.
Yeah, and then Patrick commented that the Quality Alliance programs all seem to address the upper end of wine quality and that he's more concerned about the base quality of the product.
That's a good point. Yeah, I don't know how to address that one. You probably have to talk to Merle about that. Kristen, maybe you want Merle to put on the next webinar.
Well, Merle's on here, so I'm assuming he's taking notes of all these things that are being said. So.
Okay.
Anyway, and then Tim Martinson had another question about what policy changes should wineries and vineyard owners be lobbying for with their state legislatures?
Yeah, another good question, which I don't think we're in a position to answer at this point. As I mentioned, a lot of what I presented today is preliminary. We need to do a little bit more analysis. But I would say, in general, those policies that focus on the operations of the tasting room for fine wineries are the most important, to make sure that you're in touch with your legislators. If they're tinkering with the farm winery legislation, whatever affects your tasting room is going to affect your sales, positively or negatively. That's where the money's being made right now.
Okay. And then Mike also commented that maybe something that we could look at in the future would be a multi-state cold climate wine quality certification program or set of guidelines. So, yeah, who knows? Maybe we can keep getting funding from the SCRI program and keep driving some of this stuff farther.
That'll put off retirement for a few more years.
Hey, it'll keep me in a job, so I'm all for that.
All right.
So anyway, that's all the questions that we had. If anybody else has any more questions, either related to the content presented in this webinar or not, feel free to ask them. In the meantime, I want to thank Bill very much for doing the webinar today. It's always fun to work with you.
Thanks,
and some really good information presented. Also, the link to the post-webinar survey is there in the chat bar. I will repost it again so it's on the bottom. We really do value the input that you guys provide from these surveys, believe it or not. We use it to report to the USDA to show how we're doing, and so please do take that survey. We really do use the data, believe it or not. Also, the last webinar for this season, so to speak, is going to be on April 8th, and we'll have Tim Martinson from here at Cornell and Paolo Sabatini from Michigan State University looking at presenting results from some of our crop load and training system studies in New York and Michigan. So we hope to see quite a few of you there for that. So anyway, I think that's it. Yeah. So.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And Kristlyn, have a good evening. I guess I'll see Tim online this evening.
Yep. Tim will be hosting tonight. I have to go to a thing at my son's school. So anyway, thanks a bunch, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Okay.